Okay, in our next lecture on sustainable forestry in the Caribbean, we'll take a look at Caribbean forestry, the current context. Woo woo. Alright, so what are some of the realities of Caribbean forestry? Well, in case you didn't notice, the Caribbean is quite an insular region. There's quite a lot of islands. They're fairly small, and some of them are big, and they're quite often very densely populated. However, we do have English-speaking Caribbean countries like Belize, Guyana, and Suriname, which are continental, and they are less densely populated, and they tend to have very different sorts of pressures on them. But on the small insular nations, there is intense competition for different land uses at the expense of forests. So the insular Caribbean is very closely populated and has a lot of competition for land use. The insular Caribbean is also very prone to environmental disasters affecting forests, so hurricanes, which occur fairly regularly, and hurricanes, when they come, they can destroy the forest. They can really level the forest, and that is going to have a very big impact on the ecosystem functioning of those forests, which forest managers need to take note of, or they need to prepare for. The socioeconomic context, the continental Caribbean, Belize, Suriname, Guyana, they tend to have low populations. The last forest state said that. Most of these countries tend to have very low GDP, not very low GDP, but low GDP. And they tend to focus on extractive industries, which would impact forests and are quite often a challenge to sustainability. Those extractive industries would be things like timber production, mining, agriculture, hunting, that sort of thing. Most of the countries in the region are low to middle income. They're not dirt poor, they're not like African poor, but apart from Haiti, many of them are middle income, which means that people tend to be in the cash economy. They don't grow their own food, they work and they will buy food, and quite often that food will come from outside. Their energy is quite often bought from outside the country, and therefore that takes a lot of pressure off land use. So being middle income has a big impact on the pressure for land use. A place like Haiti, with being a low income country, very low GDP country, many of the people are subsistence, and so they grow their own food, so there tends to be a big pressure on land. Also, Haiti cannot afford to buy its fuel for domestic use from outside, so it relies on forests for fuel. As a consequence, forests in Haiti are very endangered and largely cleared. Forest resource in the continental Caribbean, including continental islands, is very biologically diverse. It's in the tropics. What would you expect? So the forests tend to be mixed forests with many different species, and that has an impact on forest management. In the continental systems, the diversity is really high and remains very incompletely described. So if we're looking to conserve biodiversity, one of the first things which needs to be done is a very thorough description of the biodiversity in these areas. The oceanic or volcanic islands in the Caribbean basin show high levels of endemism. Well, it's actually moderate levels of endemism for those oceanic islands. Most of those single island endemics in the Caribbean tend to be on the larger Greater Antillean islands, not the oceanic volcanic islands. On islands, due to small size, most forest ecosystems tend to be fairly small in spatial extent, and because of the high population density, they tend to be under pressure all the time. There tends to be quite a lot of edge effects from land use around these forest patches. So the Caribbean represents an area with a complex mix of diversity, socioeconomic and natural, with uniqueness. Some of it is poorly described, particularly in the continental areas, and the use of those forests are fairly varied, and therefore make a challenge for forest management decisions. So here's a general typical example of a Caribbean island, which would give different types of ecosystems. Down around sea level, you would tend to find seasonal and deciduous forests. As you go to any sort of altitude, maybe even 100 meters up the slope, you would tend to get orographic rainfall, and then you would tend to get rainforest or evergreen forest. And as you climb at the top, the peaks of many of these islands, which quite often represent the top of the volcano, you would tend to find stunted growth, because these areas are shaded by cloud and mist for 75% of the time through orographic rainfall. So you would get elfin woodland or stunted woodland. So it's these upper areas which tended to be left, because the lower areas tended to be flatter, more easy to clear, and they would be utilized for agriculture, cleared for agricultural ecosystems, and the forests on the steeper slopes would have been left on a typical Caribbean island. Over the past 40 years, since World War II, and coincidentally, well maybe not coincidentally, since independence, there has been dramatic changes in forest management in the Caribbean. So there's been the basis of the management of forests in the Caribbean has been colonial, but there has been a shift of use of those forests from colonial times, particularly away from timber production and more to other uses. And some of those other uses would have been things like recreation and ecotourism, biodiversity protection and national parks, and non-timber tropical forest. But probably the most important use in many insular Caribbean countries is watershed and watershed management. Water is very important for all populations, and if you don't have water, life is not possible, and you need to import it. So forests on many of these insular islands are seen as watershed protectors and generators of water through protecting their catchment areas. Many of the islands of the Caribbean also rely heavily on tourism, and because of this they need their forests for ecotourism, recreation. Biodiversity is also used for ecotourism, so forests protect the biodiversity and national parks and so on. Because those main interests tend to be compromised by timber production tends to be much lower, and timber tends to be imported into these insular Caribbean countries. Non-timber forest products, on the other hand, can safely be extracted from these areas, and quite often they are. So these forests relatively now are more important for non-timber forest products than timber forest products. And here are some of the non-timber forest products which are extracted from forests around the Caribbean. Pause this video if you will and browse. So, management of Caribbean forests are driven mainly by global patterns of consumption, and that will shift the markets globally, and which will impact on the Caribbean. Less so Caribbean forests impacted by technological advances in forest science, and also ecological, or knowledge of ecological processes, and also management of tropical forests is impacted by these countries being signatories to international agreements. Quite often loan conditionalities or granting conditionalities are based on being a member of particular international agreements. So therefore, quite often these countries are forced to manage their forests in a particular way to satisfy conditionalities for loans and grants. It's a form of neocolonialism, I guess, but it tends to be one way in which developed countries can force developing countries to conserve their biodiversity. So the Earth Summit in Rio was one of those ways in which agreements, international agreements, impacted on the developing countries' treatment or management of their forests. Quite often the markets in developing countries are influenced by the markets in the developed countries, and at the moment a lot of the insular Caribbean gets the most money that it can get out of its natural resources through, yes, you guessed it, tourism. And so the forests are managed in a way which will be beneficial to the tourism industry. So you only need to go to Dominica to see that sort of thing. There are other global processes which are happening around the world today, and one of those is global climate change. And global climate change is certainly going to have a big impact on tropical forests in the Caribbean. So we'll leave this brief lecture here and go on to the next monster lecture.